On the same reef, a $500,000 yacht was reduced to shards, while a so-called floating sidewalk looked battered but unbroken. The industry said lighter, prettier fiberglass boats were the future, but in one brutal grounding, that illusion dissolved fast. Ferro-Cement, with a steel skeleton and a mortar shell, proved uglier but vastly tougher than the experts wanted to admit. Why did nearly 2,000 backyard attempts stain its reputation? And how did the material science behind these survival capsules get forgotten? The numbers, the crash physics, and the market backlash reveal a story the yachting world wants you to ignore. Let us find out why, when it truly mattered, ugly won. In the early 1970s, a fever swept through the docks and suburbs. The promise was simple: build a yacht for less than the price of a used car. Magazines and how-to books claimed anyone could pour a hull in their backyard with a few sheets of mesh, a pile of sand, and a barrel of cement. The price tag, often quoted as under $500 for materials, lit a fire under thousands of hopeful sailors. They were not just dreamers, they were builders, mixing mortar by hand and bending rebar in the driveway. By the end of the decade, as many as 2,000 ferro-cement hulls had been launched worldwide. Some were 50-foot ketches, others rough-edge sloops, all born from the same do-it-yourself gospel. The scale was staggering. Boat yards from Auckland to Vancouver watched as families, retirees, and weekend warriors turned garages and empty lots into makeshift shipyards. The boom was not limited to one country or coast. In North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Europe, the ferro-cement craze promised ocean access to anyone willing to get their hands dirty. Ads in boating magazines boasted seaworthy hulls for a tenth the price of factory fiberglass. The myth spread, concrete was the poor man's path to blue water. For a brief moment, it looked like the yachting world would be remade by a wave of backyard ingenuity. Stories circulated of globes circling voyages on boats that started life as a pile of chicken wire and sand. The appeal was raw and democratic, a rebellion against the glossy, high-dollar world of production yachts. But the flood of amateur builds, driven by cost and the thrill of self-reliance, set the stage for a hard reckoning. The numbers were real: thousands of hulls poured, countless weekends lost to mixing, tying, and troweling. A movement built on hope, sweat, and the lure of a bargain. The backlash came fast and merciless. Brokers refused to touch them. Mariners rolled their eyes at the sight of a gray, lumpy hull. The name-calling was relentless: floating sidewalk, flower pot, concrete bathtub. Newspapers ran stories mocking the backyard armada, highlighting every leaky hull and rust-stained deck. The stigma did not just stick, it calcified. By the late 1980s, a ferro-cement boat could barely fetch 5% or 10% of what a comparable fiberglass yacht would command. Listings, when they existed at all, read like classified ads for scrap metal. A 45-foot ferro-cement boat might change hands for $15,000, while a similar fiberglass sloop sailed off the auction block at $250,000. The difference was not just cosmetic, it was a market verdict, delivered with the full weight of industry scorn. Insurance companies wanted nothing to do with them. Surveyors dreaded the call. Even the good ferro-cement boats, the ones built with care, with layers of mesh and proper mortar, were tarred by the failures of the worst. One bad patch of rust, one amateur mistake, and the entire category was dismissed as junk. The press drove the point home. Magazine spreads showed cracked hulls, weeds sprouting from neglected decks, and owners with more regrets than sea miles. The message was clear: if you wanted to sell your boat, it had better be made of plastic. If you brought a ferro-cement hull to a yacht broker, you might as well have been dragging a cinder block through the door. This was not just a phase. Decades later, the prejudice still lingers. Ferro-cement boats are rarely welcomed at major marinas, and finding a buyer means accepting a fraction of the price. The yachting world learned to laugh at concrete, to sneer at the backyard builds. But buried beneath the ridicule, the story of what these boats could actually survive was lost. The physics, the real, ugly strength, never made the headlines. Instead, the market wrote off an entire class of hulls, content to judge by the rough finish and the price tag. That is the legacy of the floating sidewalk. Under the rough gray skin of a true ferro-cement hull lies a skeleton built for punishment. This is the armature. The backbone starts with welded steel rods, each one bent and joined to match the exact curve of the designer's plans. No guessing, no shortcuts, just hard steel mapped out like the ribs of a steel ship. Over this frame, layer after layer of welded wire mesh is stretched tight. Not chicken wire, not fence scraps, but heavy gauge mesh, thick squared grids, sometimes as many as 6 or 8 layers deep, each tied off by hand with thousands of wire knots. Every crossing gets its own twist, locking the mesh into a single dense cage. The mesh is deliberate and relentless. The spacing is precise. Main rods might run every 6 to 12 inches, with secondary mesh woven diagonally to catch forces from every direction. The steel content is not an afterthought. It is the muscle of the hull, making up 3 to 5% of the boat's entire volume. In a 40-foot boat, that is miles of wire and hundreds of pounds of rod, all hidden inside the mortar shell. This armature is not just for show. When a hull takes a hit, the load travels through these steel pathways, distributing force across the entire structure. The mesh acts like a net, grabbing energy and spreading it out before it can focus on a single weak spot. That is the difference between a hull that cracks and one that shrugs off a blow. The steel cage is the reason a well-built ferro hull does not fail like brittle concrete. It is a composite, steel for strength, mesh for flexibility, and mortar for protection. The result is a dense, unified shell that can flex, absorb, and survive impacts that would shatter a thinner, lighter hull. The real engineering is invisible, buried beneath the surface, but it is the reason some ugly boats keep floating when the pretty ones are already gone. Turning steel and mesh into a watertight shell takes more than brute force. The secret is in the mortar. Builders aiming for strength use a classic 1:2 ratio, 1 part Portland cement to 2 parts clean, sharp sand. No shortcuts. The sand must be free of silt and salt, the cement fresh and dry. Add too much water and the mix turns soupy, leaving hidden air pockets that become weak spots. Add too little water and it will not flow through the dense mesh, leaving dry patches that crack under stress. The ideal consistency is just wet enough to press and pack tightly around every wire. Once the mortar is mixed, speed matters. It gets pressed into the armature from both sides, layer by layer, never slopped or poured. Every inch is packed by hand or with a trowel, forcing the mix deep into the mesh. For larger hulls, builders use mechanical vibrators, long steel rods that buzz through the fresh mortar, shaking out trapped air and settling the particles. This step is non-negotiable. Vibration is what prevents voids, the silent killers of ferro hulls. Any air pocket or dry patch is a future leak, a pathway for water to reach the steel. Cover depth is a hard rule. At least 5 millimeters of mortar must shield every strand of steel from salt water. Less than that, and rust will bloom within a season. When done right, the shell reaches compressive strengths over 40 megapascals, stronger than most city sidewalks. But the work is not finished when the last trowel is set down. The hull needs to be kept damp for a week or more, wrapped in wet cloth or sprayed with water. This slow, moist cure locks in strength, preventing micro cracks and sealing the steel away from the ocean. The result is a dense, unified barrier. No voids, no shortcuts, just raw, engineered durability. Steel and mortar do not fight the same battles inside a ferro-cement hull. Each material has a job, and together they create an armored harmony that is hard to break. When a force strikes the hull, a rock, a piling, a sledgehammer, the mortar takes the hit head-on. Its strength is in compression. Mortar can withstand crushing pressures up to 40 megapascals, shrugging off forces that would snap lesser materials. But mortar alone is brittle. Push it too far and it will crack. That is where the steel comes in. Hidden inside the shell, The mesh and rods are built to handle tension. Steel yields at around 400 megapascals, about 10 times the strength of the mortar. When the hull flexes or stretches, the steel absorbs the load, spreading it across the entire cage. Instead of a single point failing, the energy is distributed. The mesh acts like a net, catching the force and holding the structure together, even if the outer layer starts to crumble. The result is a composite behavior that is more than the sum of its parts. When a grounding happens, the mortar at the impact site may pulverize into dust, but the steel keeps the shape intact. The hull dents, it might leak a little, but it does not open up. This synergy is what separates a survivor from a casualty. A thin fiberglass hull, by contrast, relies on tension alone. When the outer skin is breached, there is nothing inside to back it up. In Ferro-Cement, compression and tension work side by side. The mortar takes the punch, the steel refuses to let go. This is the hidden reason why, when disaster strikes, the ugly boat is still in one piece while the pretty one is gone. A reef is not a wall, it is a bed of knives. When a hull meets sharp rock, the entire weight of the boat is forced onto a contact patch no bigger than a fist. This is point loading, and it is the reason most boats do not survive a serious grounding. Imagine a 20-ton yacht lifted by a wave and dropped 5 feet onto a granite outcrop. Physics does not care about price tags or paint jobs. The math is brutal. 20 tons falling 5 feet can unleash over 200,000 newtons of force in a single heartbeat. That is nearly 20 tons pressing down on an area the size of a postage stamp. Hull materials face a simple question. What happens when all that energy is focused on one tiny spot? Fiberglass hulls, with their thin laminates and resin-soaked cloth, are built to spread out tension across their surface. But under point loading, the force overwhelms the fibers. The resin cracks, the layers separate, and the hull can puncture straight through. It is the eggshell problem. Fine until the pressure is focused, then it shatters. Concrete, especially when wrapped around a dense steel cage, handles this attack differently. The mortar at the impact site compresses, grinds, and pulverizes into dust, absorbing the blow. The steel armature stretches and flexes, refusing to let the hull open up. The force that would punch a hole in fiberglass gets distributed through the mesh and rebar, robbing the reef of its bite. In a grounding, survival is not about beauty or speed, it is about how a hull handles the unforgiving arithmetic of stress concentration. Coral is not soft. On the Mohs scale, it sits at about 3, roughly the same as a copper penny, but with a surface like sandpaper and the ability to grind through plastic in minutes. When a fiberglass hull meets this kind of reef, the outcome is always the same. The gel coat vanishes first, then the fibers, layer after layer, until the hull is breached. The sound is unmistakable, a scream of resin and glass, followed by silence as water floods in. It is the eggshell problem in action. Fiberglass can flex, but under point loading from sharp coral, it shatters. The hull fails catastrophically, splitting open and spilling its contents into the sea. The Ferro-Cement hull tells a different story. When it grinds against the reef, the outer layer of mortar absorbs the punishment. Instead of cracking, the mortar at the impact site pulverizes into dust, sacrificing itself to protect the steel cage inside. The grinding continues, but the hull holds. The steel mesh stretches, giving just enough to keep the boat in one piece. The reef is worn down, not the other way around. This is abrasion resistance in its purest form. The concrete hull acts like a grinding stone, outlasting the coral beneath it. The steel armature is doing the work. Survivors' logs and salvage reports echo the same pattern. Ferro boats come off the rocks scarred and battered, but intact. They might leak, but they float. Fiberglass yachts, even the expensive ones, often do not make it past the first hour. The difference is brutal and simple. When the reef calls, the EGG shell shatters, but the rock survives. A Ferro-Cement hull might walk away from a reef, but that does not mean the paperwork is easy. When a surveyor arrives, the real puzzle begins. The steel skeleton that gives these boats their strength is buried deep inside the concrete, invisible to the eye and nearly impossible to check without destructive testing. Ultrasound and moisture meters can hint at trouble, but they cannot see through dense mortar or tell if corrosion has started eating away at the mesh. Even after a hard grounding, the outer shell may look patchable, but hidden rust or micro cracks inside the armature could mean future failure. No one can guarantee what is happening beneath the surface. That is the catch. Survival on the rocks does not translate into a clean bill of health on paper. For insurers and surveyors, the unknowns turn a survivor into a question mark, not a safe bet. Salvage crews have seen it all, but even the old-timers shake their heads at the paperwork. A Ferro-Cement hull comes off the rocks looking like it lost a bar fight, chunks missing, grey dust everywhere, but the fix is laughably cheap. $10 for a bag of mortar, a trowel, and an afternoon, and the boat is ready to float again. Meanwhile, the owner of the shattered fiberglass yacht is left with a six-figure bill and a sunken shell. The insurance company calls the ferro boat a total loss, not because it cannot be patched, but because no one wants to gamble on what is hiding inside the concrete. Surveyors mutter about hidden rust and invisible cracks, but the salvage operator just shrugs. You want to see expensive? Try raising a fiberglass boat. This one, just slap on some cement and sail away. The numbers don't lie. The ugly boat wins the price war, even if nobody wants to write the check. Today, most insurance companies still blacklist Ferro-Cement hulls, but the laws of physics are not swayed by stigma. When disaster strikes, function trumps fashion every time. As storms and reefs keep testing what matters, survival favors the overlooked and the unglamorous. Beauty fades fast on the rocks. Resilience endures. In an age obsessed with appearances, the ocean reminds us that strength is never just skin deep. What would you trust your life to?